And welcome back, everybody, to day two of the California Small Farm Conference. My name is Evan Wigg. I'm with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and we are excited to have you here bright and early on a Monday morning to talk about the topic that personally I think is one of the most interesting we have here at the conference, in particular because the one question that we get most at this conference is, what do you mean by small farm? It's something we receive year after year. People are saying, "Well, does my farm qualify? What does that mean? Is it acreage? Is it a revenue? It's a family farm?" There's so many different questions around the definition. I think it's such an important, juicy conversation. So I'm really excited to hear what our lovely panelists have to say about this topic. I'm also really curious to hear what all of you have to say, because this is a definition that we're all creating, we're all sharing. So I'd love to have some audience participation as well. So there's two ways you can interact today. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see some buttons. One of them is the chat function, and if you want to introduce yourself, share insights, thoughts, that's a great place to do that. If you have questions for our panelists, go ahead and use the Q&A feature. Drop in a question there. And then we'll try to get to those at the end of the workshop or perhaps throughout if it's relevant to the conversation. So just a reminder that today's workshop is being recorded. You can find it on our YouTube channel later. But with that, I want to give a thanks to all of our panelists for joining us bright and early here. And I hope you all enjoy the conversation, and see you soon.
Cool. Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much for the great introduction. I'm glad to hear you're excited about it. That makes sense that the question of what the small farm is would be really common. So yeah, let's get into it. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about the meaning of the small farm. What does it mean? To whom? What are the implications of that? And what could it mean? We're definitely not going to be able to decisively answer those questions today, but we just want to open it up for discussion and consideration. It's a very complex topic. Before we get started, I just want everyone actually to type in the chat what they think a small farm is or how you've been defining it. We'll take like a minute to do that. So go ahead and use the chat, type in what you think a small farm is. No pressure, no shade if, whatever definition you're using, but it'll be pretty interesting to see what everyone thinks. It might take a moment to sort of think about it. I'll give you a minute. All right, farm that's smaller than 250 acres, 350,000 in annual income or less. That's the USDA. No more than 160 acres. Nice, they're populating in here. Keep it coming, keep it coming. Under 200 acres with a multi-crop offering. Less than 150 acres and low income generation with a lot of work. Yeah, well, that sounds right. 12-acre avocado farm run by a couple. Awesome. Well, anyway, yeah, keep them coming in. Feel free to scroll through that. We might come back and reference that later. Thanks for your thoughts, everyone. But I think, as you can see, if anyone's looking, you can already see the sort of range of thoughts that are coming in, whether it's acreage, it's revenue, it's a lot of work, it's a couple, it's there's all these different things, right? So yeah, thanks everyone. So my name is Evan Hazlett. I'm a human geography PhD student. I live in San Francisco and study direct market farmers and alternative food movements in California. The Bay Area has been home for about 10 years, apart from a couple stints away for grad school. And before grad school, my work included 4 years at food organizations in the Bay Area, doing everything from food security to youth culinary education, food waste, food sourcing, and advocacy. I'm joined today by Nathaniel Brown of Brown Sugar Farm, a community-supported farm in the Sacramento area. In addition to farming, Nathaniel is also co-founder of the nonprofit Ujamaa Farmer Collective, which works to secure access to resources for the success of Black farmers in the greater Sacramento region. Ujamaa envisions an equitable society where Black farmers can collectively steward symbiotic systems that work for the earth and people. We also have Professor Rachel Soper of CSU Channel Islands. Rachel researches the alternative food movement with particular interest in the relationship between environmental sustainability and social justice. Her field work experience includes indigenous small farmers in Ecuador, indigenous farm workers in Oxnard, Black urban gardeners in San Diego, and organic and regenerative farmers in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. And finally, Krista Marshall, currently the Policy and Partnership Coordinator, I think I'm getting that right, at the UC Organic Ag Institute. Very recently a small farm advisor with the UC Small Farms Network, both under UCANR, Ag and Natural Resources. Krista is passionate about building agricultural models that center dignified livelihoods, advance food sovereignty, promote regional food systems, and enable farmers to be ecological stewards of working lands. So thank you three for being here today with us. So the agenda for today, I'm going to give a presentation on the small farm first, kind of as a primer and foundation for discussion. Then we'll move on to discussion with the three panelists. I'll ask them a number of questions that will take most of the time. And then at the end, we'll open it up for audience Q&A, where you'll use the Q&A function is distinct from the chat. If you post in the chat, I'll look through as well, but there might be a lot of comments there. So try to use the Q&A function. And then I'll read your questions to our panelists, whether generally or to specific folks. All right, so let me get this screen share going for some slides. It's always fun. And we're gonna make that full screen. It's not letting me, okay. Interesting. Let me exit that again and stop share. Let me try this one more time. Okay. There's always got to be a technical difficulty. Okay. Good. I think we're good to go. Right. Right. Well, actually, now I've lost my notes. Apologies, everyone. One more second here. Okay, we're gonna have to do that again. Well, this is how it goes, everybody. Apologies, something wonky going on with the slide function here. Okay, I think we're in there. All right, well, there you go. All right, so what is the small farm? I'm going to talk about how it is variably defined, the implications of that, and offer some thoughts on a path forward. So I actually want to say a couple things up front. First, to thank CAF for letting us have this discussion. We're at their annual small farm conference. They're letting us come here and say, what do you even mean by the small farm? But I'm glad to hear, Evan, that you and others are excited about it. So I think that's awesome. And just to say second, also, this workshop is definitely not directed at this conference alone. All of us are in this work, a part of this creation of discourse and values and visions. So it's really meant for everyone here. So why are we talking about this? It's not just semantic, academic, or nitpicky. Our discourse has real material outcomes. The small farm has been a central fixture of food movements in the US and around the world for centuries. But we often use this term uncritically and without an explicit definition. This means that at worst, we can end up maybe misdirecting our energy, time, and power. And at best, there's just maybe simply missed opportunities for alignment and focus across our various work. So I'll give you an example right up front. I was at Eco Farm this year and heard someone refer to a 1,000-acre, highly capitalized conventional fruit farm in Fresno with many millions in annual revenue as a small family farm. And they were talking about the importance of preserving California's small family farms. Meanwhile, in the same day, I heard people talking about 10-acre organic farms in other counties barely scraping by, if not losing money year to year. For me, if these are both small farms, I'm not convinced the term means much, or at least not anything very useful to us. In my own research from this past year, I looked at 80 academic articles across 4 journals writing about small farms in the US and internationally. I'm not going to go deep into this, just some quick points. Only 14 of 80 actually define the term. And among those few, the definitions were nearly as numerous as the authors and truly wide ranging, often in acreage. So anywhere from 0.5 acres to 1,500 acres, depending on the region. And a few in the US used the USDA definition. 20 articles of 80 offered sort of signposts for using things like national statistics on farm sizes. But again, these were super wide ranging. The 45 articles offered no definition or signpost of any kind. And I find that's pretty common in discussions about smallness. A key finding across everything, and I find this also to be the case in many discussions, there was a normative bias often where small was being used as a stand-in for non-size attributes and qualities that those authors wanted to see in food systems, but that may not actually have anything to do with smallness and size or scale, like diversification, organic, selling at farmers markets, not proving this link between smallness, producing those practices. And we all do this. I used to do it all the time. I still do. That's what prompted this research. But I don't personally think this presumed link is so clear. If we're defining small in a million different ways, then we can't really prove that link. But even if we do define smallness by some size or scale measure, there's no guarantee that smallness produces the outcomes we want. So there's this 2020 literature review of 30 years of agroecology research, and it found there was no causal link in any of the studies between farm size and ecological sustainability. Rather, sustainability was a result of farmer practices and management, not their size. We all know smaller conventional farms. We all know larger organic farms. We know small farms that are financially viable and enormous farms that are in the red and constantly in debt. So smallness doesn't necessarily cause desired outcomes. There may be a size or scale threshold after which farmers are less able to manage land ecologically, say, or less likely to have fair labor practices. And there is some research that suggests this relationship, but those thresholds are always hazy and they're not decisive. But most importantly, they'd have to be demonstrated empirically. I want to jump to the USDA. So the USDA is interesting. We have to look at their definition of small and family together because the USDA only has a size typology for family farms. And their typology has made it so that we think 98% of US farms are family farms. But the USDA, real sneaky, classifies family farms as, quote, any farm organized as a sole proprietorship, partnership, or family corporation. Family farms exclude farms organized as non-family corporations or cooperatives, as well as farms with hired managers. So, sole proprietor. That means if you own and operate a farm by yourself with no family members, you're still a family farm. And partnership is also not clarified. From what I can tell, this could be any business partnership with a family member or not. So that allows the USDA to conveniently call pretty much every American farm a family farm. But not all of those are family farms. Those are just farms. Imagine how this must drastically bloat that number. I haven't been able to easily find data on that, but I think that's probably by design because the USDA really loves to romanticize the American family farm, which I'll come back to in a bit. Oh, actually, same slide. So let's move to size. So again, the USDA only created a size typology for these so-called family farms. So every small farm is a small family farm by definition. In 1998, the National Commission on Small Farms under the USDA recommended that small farms be those with under 250,000 in annual sales. But immediately after this, they acknowledged the significance of that number depends so much on geography, commodity, markets you're tapped into, revenue that varies a ton year by year depending on market prices. In 2013, the USDA's Economic Research Service updated small to those under 350,000 in sales. They say to account for inflation and then an increase in a number of very large farms. Though it's unclear to me why an increase in large farms should change our definition of small, if small is just something we're aiming for. They also added a mid-size category of 350,000 to 1 million, and now large is over 1 million. So size for the USDA has nothing to do with acres, labor, management style, ownership, assets, capital, and so on. It's just gross cash farm income. So we're left with what I think is a definition that's not very dynamic. It's kind of myopic. It's pretty arbitrary. It's poorly justified in the present, and then it's based on this poorly justified definition from 1998. Let's look at some organizations. So of course, I had to talk about CAF. This is the CAF conference. Again, not pointing any fingers. These are complex and tough questions. I'm definitely pointing fingers at the USDA. Okay, so 3 organizations here. First, CAF Strategic Plan, 2023 to 2028. CAF prioritizes the family scale farm, quote, those farming at the community scale, working the land sustainably, growing healthy food for their communities, and contributing to their local economy with their hands in the soil. For me, this is getting closer to something concrete, sort of pointing in a useful relational direction. I'd want them to really elaborate what each of these terms mean to them. How are they defining sustainability? There's a lot of disagreement about that. What's healthy food? Who is the community? How big is that boundary socially, economically, geographically? What is the local economy? So California didn't used to do this, but they now currently define local food as food produced anywhere in the state. I'm from Massachusetts. California is 3 times the size of New York State. 16 times the size of Massachusetts. What does hands in the soil mean? Is there a threshold? What aspects of labor matter most? So these are all, they're important, but they're slippery ideas. Um, this definition is not about small or large, but it is a direction. Though relatedly, I haven't seen a definition of small farm for this conference, so I'd be curious if they're thinking of it as this family scale farm, if they're using the USDA definition, or if they have something else in mind. The Santa Clara County Food System Alliance report from 2020, Small Farms, Big Potential is what they call it. It's all about some more supporting small farms in the county. There's no definition, though. They do tell us that 47% of farms in the county are 1 to 9 acres, 31% are 10 to 49 acres, and 78% are less than 50 acres. But that's still a pretty big range. 1 to 50 acres is pretty huge. And I would imagine the variety of challenges, revenues, practices, backgrounds, and experiences within that range is probably pretty enormous. Finally, the UW-Madison Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems, a mouthful, their 2004 report, A Matter of Scale, really has a lot of great tidbits and insights. I'd suggest checking it out. They believe smallness involves four variables: land, financial impact, who does the labor, and management and ownership. So they say a small farm has a small or moderate physical footprint, a small or moderate financial footprint, but they don't define small and moderate. So that's a little tough. And then one where the farm family provides more than 50% of labor and the farm family retains management control, which they sort of loosely define as freedom from long-term contracts that constrain the farm family's independence and agency. And they also say maybe a high level of land and asset ownership, though they recognize that many farms or small farms don't own land or capital. This report has a ton of insights that capture one of the key points here, which that it's super hard to pin down smallness. Each one of these four variables vary independently of one another. So, for many different reasons. And that distinction between small, medium, and large for each variable is still pretty hazy. So for instance, they point out that in Illinois, a 700-acre soybean farm is often small by USDA revenue threshold, 700 acres, while a dairy farm of 300 acres in the state could easily be large based just on income. So you're left with this huge number of combinations between variables with unclear distinctions. I think you could also add more variables, which I'll get to in a bit. So let's get back to why this matters. And then I'll offer some sort of concluding remarks on where I'm feeling like maybe this leads us. There are a number of reasons this matters. I guess most simply, if we're all using the term small farm a lot to represent something we're fighting for or think is important, but we're using it very differently, or we're not explicitly defining it, which is often the case, then we're just kind of talking past each other about something really important. From an earlier point, at worst, this means we could be misdirecting our energy, time, and power, or at best just not capitalizing on possible synergies between your work and the work of others, or narrowing your focus maybe. The second reason, while not everyone uses the USDA definition, it's still a really important signpost. The USDA policymakers and advocacy orgs, when they're talking about where they're going to put their resources. The problem is, for me, again, I don't think it's a very good definition. So simply assigning a sort of arbitrary sales cutoff, it makes doing statistics a whole lot easier, but I just don't think it actually tells us that much that's useful about those farms as a group across the country. This gets to a key consideration, which I sort of hesitate to say because I know we're at the small farm conference, but small farms, whatever those are maybe they're not the most important part of what we're advocating for. When I'm in these spaces, I see people talking mostly about other things: social and racial justice, beginning and new entry farmers, farmers of color, immigrant farmers, women farmers, organic and ecological farming, diversification, fighting agribusiness, regional or hyperlocal marketing, community embeddedness, and so on. But there's not a one-to-one relationship between smallness and these groups or the practices we value. There's no guarantee that a relatively small-scale farm, by whatever measure, practices organic, for instance, or sells to regional markets, or super embedded in local social networks and deeply cares about their community. This points to a distinction between small as a current condition or stepping stone and small as a vision of the future, which we'll come to in the discussion. So if you're fighting for viable and financially stable Black or women-owned farms in Yolo County, for instance, these identity groups might not all be small farmers. On the other hand, these groups may face barriers that cause most farmers among them to be constrained to relatively small plots with low levels of capital. So some are, or most maybe, are small now, but maybe the goal is for them to become a mid-sized farm because they might be struggling to break even when they're small. So is the goal small, Or is it just that the people you're fighting for are currently on small farms? If smallness is an end goal you're fighting for, I would gently challenge you to consider the ways this might be a relatively privileged perspective to take. The organic or ecological farms in California of relatively small acreage that I know of that have a good livelihood usually have multiple forms of relatively inaccessible privilege. They've owned the land for a long time. They have a high off-farm income or intergenerational wealth. They have powerful friends. They inherited or were gifted capital. They have really high quality farmland. Or this one actually seems really key. They were able to lock in market access to the best farmers markets, health food stores, schools, restaurants, and so on, sometimes for decades across the state. So they're making a high return on all their product. So to fight for smallness as an end goal, it just might not be realistic for most of the farmers we're talking about. And finally, all this maybe limits our visions of the future. If we're focused on smallness, it's difficult for us to imagine successful mid-sized or larger ecological farms that are community embedded and values oriented. And we might be missing targeting the specific barriers to achieving that vision, like the limits to private property ownership or the saturation of direct marketing in California. If we're focused on the family, it's difficult for us to imagine cooperative or communal farms that might be able to manage much more land with much more revenue with their hands in the soil, all of them. The small family farm, as many of you probably know, is linked to a romanticized Jeffersonian notion of the small, independent yeoman farmer serving as the backbone of American democracy. But this ideal has its roots in an idealized white nuclear heterosexual family with 160 acres of homestead land at $1.25 an acre. It's not only economically inaccessible today, but socially conservative. And finally, by focusing on the small farmer, the farm owner, we continue to make invisible the farm workers who keep it all afloat. If a farm worker owned, say, horizontally with farm workers or shared ownership with workers, workers become owners. And suddenly there are more owners who all have their hands in the soil. So a farm family of 4 suddenly becomes a farm of 30, all with their hands in the soil. So reintroducing farm workers centrally into the narrative forces us to maybe reconceptualize inherited ideas of small and family. So to conclude, what are some things we could or should mean by small, and are there drawbacks? I like the UW-Madison definition. It's just so many variables and they vary independently. I'd be interested how useful that actually was for categorizing. You could also add variables like the scale of retail or marketing and the scale of debt or financial leverage. Large agribusiness farms are often entirely tied into international retail supply chains, highly dependent on supply contracts and leverage into the millions of dollars to buy machinery. Relative scale might be relevant. What lands or revenue size or labor structure is relatively small compared to some average geographically or by commodity, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with the qualities we desire. Is it about limited resource farmers who lack sufficient access to land, labor, and capital and markets to be financially viable? But then that could be many of the farmers in the country, many of whom might not be farming the way we'd like, or may have many hundreds of acres, which may be out of reach for, I'd say, probably many of the farmers at this conference. Maybe it's about beginning or new entry farmers because they tend to be small at first. But then we just really mean beginning farmers, not small farmers. If we're focused on ecological sustainability, it could be about some size where managing ecologically becomes difficult or impossible. But that number will always be shifting depending on ownership, management, labor structure. And then we're really just talking about sustainability, not size. It would also depend on whether you're talking about organic certifications or practicing agroecology. Earthbound Farms has 50,000 acres of organic land. Some people who are strong organic advocates, they say that's sustainable. Others will say it's not, and that there's no way to manage all that land ecologically, though perhaps a large cooperative with highly empowered worker owners could do it. Finally, it could be the farmer's attitude and relations towards land, production, labor, their community. Are they always trying to maximize profit, no matter the social and environmental costs, or are they balancing profit with social and environmental values? This could be a great measure, though, again, I'm not convinced being values-oriented requires you to be small, or that smallness guarantees values. So then we're just talking about values, not smallness. So if we're going to say small, I think we first just need to be more explicit about how we're using it. So it's no longer abstract and becomes concrete. At least then it's clear, and then we can debate it. On the flip side, I'm not convinced small is as useful as we think. I personally think we should just be as specific and detailed as possible when we're talking about farms. I'm researching farms that sell at farmers markets in Fresno County. I'm advocating for new entry Latino farmers, conventional and organic, in Salinas Valley, who do mixed wholesale and direct marketing. I'm working with queer cooperative farmers on communally owned land up and down the Pacific coast and so on. Okay, so that's my soapbox. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. And we are just going to jump right into a discussion with our panelists. I'm done chatting. I'll just facilitate with questions. But I'm curious to start. It's a big topic. So I thought a good way in actually was just like any general reactions you've been having to this topic. We've talked a few times now as a group and one-on-one. Anything in what I presented that stands out? And how are you thinking about defining small farms? And we'll go one by one for this one. And on my screen, Rachel, you're first.
Evan, that is just so much to unpack. Um, I think in terms of using small, the only way it makes sense to me is in terms of amount of land. And I think that's actually what most of us are referring to when we think of small scale. I think we can, try to make claims that certain small scale farms also have kind of equitable outcomes or social or ecological outcomes. But it's really in terms of size. And I think that even though it's problematic in certain ways, holding on to the term small farm I think is useful because of how certain, socially disadvantaged, historically underserved farmers, when they're starting out, and if we're trying to advance farmer equity and equitable access to land, then then when we say a small farm, if what we're actually kind of advocating towards is, small farmers of color, um, then that's its most um, useful direction, regardless of kind of ecological production practices or marketing channels.
Awesome. Nathaniel, you are next.
Yeah, I think more than anything, what stood out from the slide and just like not necessarily my definition of a small farm, but it's like the idea that this family farm is kind of going away. Not kind of, it is this whole transfer of land, just coming back from up the hill and just like so many properties for sale, so many already planted vineyards and things like that. But it's like, what's happening? It's like, no, people are just aging out, and there isn't new young people that can actually afford to get into it. Like you mentioned, like the people that can do it are the folks that have money, have inherited some of the land, have powerful friends, and like um, for me, I had to fight, not fight, but I feel like when I started my urban farming journey, it was fighting to say my little urban plot, a quarter acre, can't even enter 1 acre into a lot of these, pamphlet or not pamphlets, but templates that I'm supposed to sign up for through the USDA or the CDFA. So now it's kind of like pushing to fight for that, like small, but don't put me in the same group as 150 acres because I am trying to get to however many acres I can um, afford to manage. But I think that is like, we're at this pivotal time. So it's like a very good question to be thinking about of like, it should be able to support a family or families and whoever's involved in it or seeing that food being grown. But um, are we concerned about the cooperative structure and how much money they're making? Or are we concerned more about like the ecological practices that are going on? Because like what if that was the everyone voted with their dollar of buying the best thing? So, you know, uh just Seems more like supporting scaling farmers that are trying to improve whether it's their practices, their sustainability, or their size.
Hmm. So it could be sort of a relationship of a bunch of different things. Like the way you think about small farm doesn't necessarily have a cutoff in terms of size, sales.
I mean, I think to an extent, there's, like if I owned 500 acres, I mean, when I talked to someone last year at Eco Farm about like, well, how many is the least amount of acres that I could get to start a cotton farm? 300. That's not small to me. I'm like, I wouldn't call that, oh yeah, my small farm. But when you look at all the cotton growers all over the US, that's a small farm, a small cotton farm. So, that kind of puts things in perspective of like how are we going to transfer the land to the new farmers, the beginning farmers, the farmers that are trying to scale into those spaces because we still need rice, wheat, corn. Like those things aren't just going to go away overnight. And yeah, a lot of them are conventional or like, you have to accept the conventional land to then put it in ecological practices. Or you have to, kind of go with the conventional way you have to infiltrate to change. You can't just, oh, I'm gonna get my own land. It'd be way easier to buy a rice or a wheat or whatever operation to convert it. Um, yeah, there's just some initial thoughts from the video.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, those are really, really great thoughts. The point about the cotton farm, I think captures actually a lot of the sort of considerations because you're right, 300 acres small for cotton farm, very big for organic
A
diversity.
diversified veggies, yeah,
Northern
yeah.
California, yeah. And so it's like and that's where for me getting really specific, sort of detailed about what you are really talking about. And then there's different maybe like scales of relation that are involved in it. So if you're a cotton farmer on 300 acres monocropping, you're probably tied into these more large scale transnational agribusiness circuits, and that it's that scale of retail also that sort of defines your relation to smallness or largeness. I want to jump to Krista.
Yeah, that everything is resonating. I think something that comes up for me, and we've talked about in preparing for this workshop is, and what I really resonate with is this idea that like we really just need to articulate our history, where we are and where we want to go. And I think sometimes what I find with can be confusing for me, both as someone who is a public servant who works for cooperative extension, as well as I operate a mutual aid community-run farm in Sacramento that is half an acre, and on the flip side is often actually called a garden, and we consider ourselves a farm. So it's kind of maybe a different end of the spectrum, but I think sometimes I see small as kind of coding the goals or visions that we have, and rather than coding them, maybe we move in kind of what Evan has been musing about into really articulating what we want out of the agricultural system that we're trying to either critique or move towards or kind of build models for. And so I think really being explicit about the socio-political and economic and cultural and ecological goals from like an individual farm scale, like Nathaniel was talking about, like, really helping farmers to achieve the goals that they're articulating for themselves, as well as like how that fits into larger societal goals. Because yeah, and there's so many contradictions. Like an example that comes up is like if someone does consider themselves, you know, ecological, but they're putting a lot of pressure on our water systems in California, which societally, like we need to move towards different kinds of, understandings of water management and conservation and stewardship. Like, do those goals conflict, or are they aligned? And so I think for me, what I would love to muse on, and I don't think that there's, an arrival point, at least in the context of this webinar, is coming to a consensus about being really explicit and articulate about kind of what kind of farming systems we want to work towards. And I think in some ways, I think that there's like boundaries around this. I think sometimes the scale is, to me, maybe more agnostic than anything. It is one of many descriptors of a farm system rather than like the arrival point of the system itself. And so, I think it would be really interesting to continue to kind of talk about and articulate and come to some, maybe not full consensus, but at least a shared understanding of maybe like, rather than coding our goals and our values within the scale of the farm, actually being articulate about what those values are in the first place.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I have questions for each of the three of you specifically now, and actually the way I wrote them is perfect to just go backwards. So we'll start with Krista again. And to the extent, you're sort of comfortable, if you can reflect holistically on your work at UCANR with regard to this, some guiding questions, like how is small used there? Have you found you feel like you have a consistent sense of what it means in the work? Has it been useful? In what cases, yes? Maybe what cases, no? Is there like tension between that focus and other values that UCANR or that your team also really cares about? So feel free to sort of dive into any of that.
Yeah. I guess I would start by saying, I think, the goal of extension is to, direct public resources and capacity towards everyone. There's a lot of history at cooperative extension of not serving small scale farmers. And so there's been an increased effort on making sure that at least there's always more need for public resources in my opinion, but there's a very, very qualified, knowledgeable, community-based team across the state who are serving small-scale farmers. And for, that program and for the work that I've done and kind of how we work, there is, I would say, a more kind of like characteristic-based definition of small scale. I think most of the time people are serving, folks who are operating probably less than 60 acres across California. However, it's a really diverse state, so we tend to define it as diversified, family or sole proprietors, immigrant refugee farming communities, maybe folks who have language access issues because most incentive programs, it's changing, but often things are provided in English, folks who are maybe growing crops that don't have a focus within cooperative extension. So, if you're growing mixed Asian vegetables, like there are some resources, but it's not going to be as robustly developed as like a commodity, pistachios, almonds, things like that. And so the program is really trying to, and I appreciate, it's an explicit articulation that like these are the people that we're trying to serve through this work. Often those people are small scale. And I think as we've all kind of talked about, there is kind of a tension, which is like, there may be many people who fall within those characteristics that are not operating, quote, smaller scale farms. But that's, the goal of that program. And so I think, in that way, it's been really great to work amongst a qualified team of folks across the state who are really, able to use those values and those characteristics to drive their cooperative extension work. And I do think it's kind of inconsistent, maybe by design, because California is so diverse, right? Like those characteristics on a landscape are going to look really different in San Diego versus Humboldt County versus the Sierra foothills versus Fresno and the Sacramento Valley. So I think, in some sense that actually helps to reach goals because it's not as confined. And so, the real goal for us is, and I guess everyone in cooperative extension, but particularly Small Farms Network and Organic Ag Institute, is to make sure that people who are historically and or currently not served by the public resources of extension and outreach can make sure that they have some sort of focus in programmatic work and can access those resources.
That's awesome. I guess I was just curious to follow up, like if you ever feel any tension with you, like what you're doing with USDA programs. Like there was just a comment in the chat from Marissa or Marisa. It's useful, small farm useful for policy making, but feeling like maybe relational definitions are more accurate, but they're harder to set up simple transactions around. And I think that's like USDA, big federal agency, CDFA, like they're trying to simplify and make legible things that are really complex. but it's sort of potentially is too coarse a cut. I guess I'm wondering if you can speak to that tension at all with state agencies, maybe.
Yeah, I think, I think federal level is maybe a little bit too much of a behemoth to tackle,
Yeah.
but I do think some of the work I've done with cooperative extension has been specifically working with California Department of Food and Agriculture on some of their programs and incentive opportunities. And I think something that is really cool that they're doing is, while, I think it's maybe some aspects of the work are being simplified at an institutional level. I do think that they're actually a really great example of a state agency who is trying to shift contextual understanding to the community-based organizations and the public institutions who understand communities better than them. And they're like very humble, and they're very supportive of trying to shift, for example, a lot of their grant programs to a block grant style that allows organizations to define the application process and work with the people that they know on the ground. And so I think that actually in some ways maybe helps us to address some of these conflicts, because the folks who are doing that work have more direct relationships to the farmers who are, in need of and interested in applying to incentive programs or receiving technical assistance to comply with regulatory changes and other things. So I suppose, I think in many ways it's kind of interesting that in some sense it feels very constricted, and then in other senses there's actually like, a shift towards trying to add more context so that like some of these tensions can be addressed by the people who maybe, are working more closely on the ground.
Super good point. And kind of related, a good sort of comment here in the chat from Amanda about if we're coding or categorizing with terms, it may be actually or being more explicit. I think I'm reading this comment correctly, means like acknowledging so much exploitation of people and land. So to many of the panelists' points, coding or categorizing, I think, as I'm understanding, works against what many of us are working toward, and sort of being more specific in that work. So yeah, to move to Nathaniel now. Thank you so much, Krista. With regard to land, marketing, capital, labor, operations, anything, you sort of talked about this a little bit, is there a scale you're aiming for, and sort of what's the measure for that in your mind? Then you don't have to think about small, medium, large, just like what's the scale you're sort of maybe aiming for in your vision for yourself? And are there sort of specific values you hold or needs that are causing you to pursue that scale? And then I guess conversely, is there scale as a farmer you're trying to avoid, like when you think about what farms could become?
I think this is it's a interesting question for me because I continually had to keep realizing that I need to scale up in order to keep doing this for the rest of my life. And because I got into it at such a young age, and like I will say, like the average farmer is like 30 years older than me. So, and a lot of farmers that I know, they're able to do it like as a early retirement kind of thing. Like they already had a job, or they have a family that is already supported. Their kids have already grown up. I don't even have kids yet, but technically I'm family farm because I'm sole proprietor. I'm the sole person doing this. But just like to give context, like going from half acre or like quarter acre, I'm able to grab another, manage another 3 acres. And like owning the land doesn't really have, for me, that's why I got into it, is to be in relationship to land and to, I mean, at the farmers markets, working with folks and, farmers that are intentional about their crops and like doing these, I mean, not a lot of commercial or like not a lot of farmers that are bringing stuff to people that are like buying produce, do these ecological practices. Um, so I think that idea in itself is like very romanticized, and why I got into it, why I started working for the farm that I did. or take a family farm, this beautiful family that really only the parents wanted to do it. They have kids, but they're not wanting to farm. And again, the family farm is going away and bringing more communal partnerships and like how, younger new farmers can work with them. I mean, I would like to hopefully take over their orchard when they're done, when they're not able to use it. And for me, is there a scale that I'm trying to stay away from? Not necessarily, but I think that um, because I'm doing diversified all year fruits, I can only be in so many places at one time. I can only harvest so much, or even bring a crew or get a crew in all these different places. But like, if I was even a more ecologically minded, I'll just bring it back to the cotton thing. Like, I wouldn't be going all over the place. I'd need like 500 acres in one space. It'd be mainly monoculture. I would rotate my crops because even the conventional farmers are doing it. They run cover crops as well. So like, do I want to get there? I don't know. Like, we're in the breadbasket of America. Yolo County, where I'm scaling up to 4 acres from a quarter acre, is, there's great potential to grow even larger than that. Past the like threshold of what people are thinking at like 15 or 10 to 20 acres of like, oh, like if I have more than that, I'm not a small farm. If I'm not, like, what if I am still in it and I'm, pushing for justice and I'm pushing for, ecologically minded stuff, like that doesn't mean that it would mean I'm not a small farm, but that's not a bad thing. And I think that's what we're trying to get to. The idea is that like small farms aren't inherently just great, but in reality, we're looking for that relationship to land. Do the farmers have a relationship to the land? Do they live on it? Do they have their hands in the soil? And sometimes, I mean, the farmer has to hire enough people and be on the computer and making deliveries. It's not necessarily the hands in the soil. Um, so yeah, very broad answer to what I'm trying to. I guess there's not anything that I'm trying to avoid. I think that it's like bringing these values and ecological practices into scaling. I'm not going to say large farms because by all these definitions, I don't think I'll get there. But maybe if I am a part of a larger cooperative that we all own a part of that. And like you were mentioning earlier, like these models are mainly for monocrops right now, but we're trying to break the barrier there to, think about how we can collectively have relation to land and stewardship of that land, but also farm businesses because the transfer of land is happening and we need to have small farms to take the places of those larger farms that have been there.
Mm. Yeah, really amazing insights. And I guess as a quick follow-up, as you think about scaling up, and obviously there's a lot of really great values you hold and trying to do ecological principles, relationship to the land, knowing your community, like is, it's maybe a hard question to answer, but is there like a size or acreage where you're like, man, if I got to that many acres, I don't know that I'd be able to do it anymore. I think I would start to lose something, lose my connection. Like I couldn't keep my mind or my relation to all of that land. So I guess when you're thinking about scale, is there a point where you're like, yeah, is there some sort of threshold you can imagine where you'd be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this anymore?
I mean, I guess right now, and maybe I can look back at this in a while. Uh, like 100 acres over that, I don't really feel like for what I'm doing. Like leaving these possibilities of like just the big three that I think of because they're grown in the area is wheat and rice and cotton, like things that we can't really just stop growing. I don't think I'm gonna get there at this time, but like for my fruit and for, scaling up to have well, no, I'm not even gonna say 100 because there's some property that we're looking. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We gotta think bigger. I think we gotta think bigger. Especially as like a black farmer, there has been all these barriers to be like, oh, stay urban farm. You're like, let's put this urban farm as a pedestal and be able to fund that. It's like, no, 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 fund getting more land, and so we can be, growing food. I mean, yeah, yeah. So I guess I'll cap it at 250.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I mean, no, awesome, awesome points. I love that. And I always think of like Full Belly Farm always comes to mind. It's 400 acres organic. Um, I'm pretty sure healthcare benefits for workers, et cetera. I mean, I don't know. They're a very successful farm. But 400 acres is pretty big. And I know they have a lot of revenue. So okay, we could talk forever. Let's keep it moving to Rachel. So we've got our extension, UCINR person, we've got our farmer, nonprofit organizer, and we've got our researcher. I'm really curious to hear you describe more about how small farmers show up in your research, and you've done research in a lot of places. So Ecuador is a very different sociocultural and geographical space than California. But how do you think about smallness in these places, the usefulness of that term, and has this smallness ever been in tension with sort of other farmer or food movement values? And I think that showed up in Ecuador. I'll start there.
Um, yeah, so my dissertation project was on the food sovereignty movement in Ecuador, which is about redistributing access to land and government resources to indigenous farmers. And so I lived with different farming communities, indigenous farming communities, and studied their production practices. And so they're small scale in the terms of having, only a couple hectares each. So about 5 acres or so. So small landholding sizes. But besides, and then family labor as well, like only family labor. But besides that, they varied a lot in terms of their production practices, and ecological production practices. Some were more chemical intensive, some were organic certified. And also, despite being so small, some kind of exported to, had larger kind of commodity chains. And so from that research, I started thinking of small, not conflating those with being also sustainable or also being local, right? That these things are just different.
Mhm.
And then in my research in California, kind of similar to your study, studying farmers market growers. So growers, and in my particular case, I'm in Ventura County. So growers in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties who sell particularly diversified vegetables at farmers markets, and a similar type comparison of their production practices. Um, and what I found were among these diversified vegetable growers, about, half of them were like Latino, previously farm workers turned farmers, who had, kind of transitioned from earning a wage to kind of being owner operators of their own farms on leased land. And they tended to be smaller scale in terms of acreage, so like 4 acres to about 20 acres. And then the other farmers who were selling at the farmers markets in the area were larger than that, we could say mid-size or mid-scale, kind of from 40 acres to up to 300 acres. Um, but when you compare their production practices, it's actually the mid-scale farmers that had kind of more conservation practices, better soil health practices, were much more likely to be organic certified than the smaller scale. So that's just another example of how, you know, being smaller doesn't necessarily mean also being ecological. And sometimes if you have what you're referring to earlier, like the racing class privilege to own land or to have longer term leases, then you have the kind of privilege um, to have more sustainable production practices. And I think that's why it is important to support small farmers with these types of government resources and the type of services that UCA&R provides, in order to kind of help them like get over those barriers that they face to kind of incorporating cover crops or whatever it may be, to be more sustainable and to grow in size
Mm.
and scale, right? As Nathaniel was referring to, in terms of just because they're small now doesn't mean they have to always be small. But yeah, I think we need to support small scale farmers in terms of those who have less access to land, which oftentimes, but not always, correlates with coming from more of a disadvantaged background. Um, and that they should be supported kind of regardless of other qualities that we might attribute to small farms, right? Even if they aren't organic certified or,
Right.
along those lines.
Right. I'm curious, a quick follow-up. Right, some of those smaller farms not necessarily organic or doing ecological principles, and some of the mid-sized ones may be better at that. Among the small ones, was there like a breakout in terms of like, hey, I'd really like to be organic. I don't have the capital, time, resources. I don't have the market for it. Or was it like, actually, I don't care. I just want to be a successful, viable farm?
It was about half and half, I would say. Yeah, about half and half of the smaller scale. Some of them, especially the ones that are smaller, like 4 acres, are really like, it's more expensive to buy organic allowable inputs than it is to buy synthetic fertilizer, and I just, can't afford to. Or a lot of it came down to not being able to afford to hire someone to do the paperwork, as well. So, and then there are others that are like, you know what? No, I want higher yield to be able to support my livelihood, and therefore don't really ever see being able to be organic. So, just and in terms of like the CDFA transition to organic pilot program, I think this demographic is really like ripe for that program. Like some of them, they just need that little push, right? And that could make a big change in their production practices.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Super important insights. As always, there's never enough time, and as always, we fill the space more than we expect. You have all answered in various ways some of my additional questions. I do have a couple more, but actually, because it's 9, I want to turn to the audience and do a little Q&A. So um, there's so many comments in the chat, so if you can try to use the Q&A function. If your window is small, it might be under that little button that says more, but just open it up. You can type your question in there. We've got a few right now. If we run out of questions, I always have more questions. So, but don't be shy. You don't, for our shy folks and introverts, you can just type it. You don't have to say it in front of everyone. So there's a couple quick ones here. What's the definition of a mid-scale farm? That's, yeah, just as tough as small. But the USDA, it's very clear, 350,000 in sales to 1 million in sales. That's how they think about it. We could definitely try to unpack that. I'm curious. I'm just gonna see what the other questions are coming in here.
There's
You go
there's
ahead.
one I really would like to just kind of briefly touch on
Yeah, go for it.
from Muriel. said how many small farms raise both plants and animals and use their own manure and so forth. I was doing that on my quarter acre, and it took up all of my life. And if you think that someone can do it on larger than, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not possible, and I think it's more manageable. The larger you get, it's actually somewhat easier, but still, I would say under 40 acres, if you're growing an actual diversified and using that manure, actually doing something, not just grazing. Um, it's one of the hardest things to do because, yeah, there's so, I think this idea that it's this, permaculture-esque, diversified farm is really a lot of, even me, I'm all organic, but even just plastic rotard. That wasn't something that was in my head. It was like, oh, I'm ecological. I don't use that. I got I got too much to do to be weeding all day. So it's like we don't want exploitation of the workers. We don't want the farmers to just be working so hard just for us to feel good about how things are grown. It's more about like how can we make them sustainable in the most ecological way possible. And some of that is like putting better money into longer lasting plastic. So it's not thrown away after one season and stuff like that. I think, you know, as we break down these barriers in our mind of what's right and wrong.
So many good questions coming up. Nathaniel, this might be best for you actually. So you mentioned something about communal partnership. Heather would like to hear more. How does that work in reality? Will the family land not be transferred to the children, but to another holding entity or legal partnership entity?
Situational, I guess. Yeah, it would be, I mean, the agreements and leases and formal agreements that many of these family farms and things, it was on a handshake. And I I mean, yeah, I think that's a big one. I think that it's mainly situational when it comes to transferring and how land is held. Sorry, I was trying to see the question to reread
Yeah.
it.
Were you able to find it, Nathaniel?
So no, not necessarily.
Well, we can also circle back to that question. There's a couple Hester, right, got the USDA definition, wanted to know more about how people distinguish small and mid-scale. I think anyone can jump in on that. I don't know, Krista, if you have any additional thoughts in your work, like how you distinguish between small and mid-scale, and I'm sure Nathaniel would have a lot to say as well, but maybe Krista, jump to you.
Yeah, I think, I'll maybe restate what I said earlier on in the workshop. For me, often I find that it's easier to decode what we mean by in terms of scale. So for me personally, I think like when I think of mid-scale, I suppose in some ways like very kind of neutrally, I think about it as being like the next section that entities like CDFA or the USDA define. So like for me, I often think it's like more than 250 acres, but less than blah, blah, blah. But I do think, we talked a little bit about in prepping for this webinar, like there are many mid-scale farms, mid-scale and acreage, not necessarily like just simply like in the scale of their operation. There's a lot of farms that are operating at those sizes that are doing a lot of really like values-based work. And so I think like for me personally, I think I'm maybe post this webinar, I'm going to be really moving intentionally towards using any sort of scale descriptive as just being the description of the scale of the operation rather than kind of coding it as any other with any other things, as I often think mid-scale can be increasingly associated with more like commodity-based farming, which I think similar to kind of what we're talking about with kind of correlation, like often smaller scale operations they can overlap with these social values and this movement work around agriculture, but not always. And I do think similarly with mid-scale, like you do often see, but not always, maybe like a shift towards a different kind of agricultural system, the like larger acreage that you get. And that's not always true. So I think, I suppose my initial response to that would be like, maybe this is an opportunity for all of us to start to kind of shift our understanding of like just saying something like mid-scale farm or small-scale farm might not be enough to really understand and articulate like who we are working with and what the values of our work are trying to, accomplish as an end goal.
Yeah. Lots of good questions, and I keep scrolling through the chat as well. Yeah, that mid-scale farm though, just to jump off that as well, it's just as complicated as small in the sense that like, technically, sorry to keep coming back to full belly, but they're technically a large farm by kind of any standard, like 400 acres of kind of diversified organic, and millions in revenue, and yet they sell to a lot of these local markets. Although, and it's not to throw shade, but they have been around for a long time, and so they have access to those markets. So it's hard to know, like, is that a scalable model for every diversified farm in California? Not sure, because I'm not sure the markets exist. So if you do get to that mid scale, you probably are selling more to these like kind of national commodity markets. And then meanwhile, I've talked to farmers with 10 to 20 acres who have a great livelihood, again, because they have really good markets locked in. And so they're year after year able to consistently sell. And so they're probably in the mid-scale range for the USDA at least, but definitely small in acreage. But they're like financially viable. So I'm thinking of them more as like a mid-scale farm because I sort of am thinking about small as like struggling in some way, which maybe isn't fair. But that's why it just gets all complicated. There was a quick question for me, and I can't. Oh, Nathaniel, trying to jump in. Go ahead.
No, just on that note, and like, shouts out to Full Belly.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it is like this pinnacle of like, especially in this area, to be like, you want to be able to like have your, I mean, it's almost, I don't want to say unfathomable, but it's like, I wouldn't be able to really sell at the co-op because the co-op probably wouldn't have as much stuff, and they wouldn't be able to say like, hey, we've actually got this local produce. They'd be, leaning more on Earthbound and others, that are much, much larger. So I do think it's like important to highlight those small mid-scale farmers or like larger organic farmers. And I think when we talk about, like Krista was saying, you identify them as such: organic, conventional, uh, small for their size, or small for their commodity or their crop. And it is more helpful to be descriptive like that.
Yeah, I mean, and I know for a lot of people, Full Belly kind of is the dream, and it's like if that's the vision, which is it's a cool at least midterm vision. Then it's like it's not just enough to be like more farmers should do that. Obviously, it's like there's so many problems: land access, market development for regional health food outlets. And so the farmers we're also so focused on farmers, technical assistance, business assistance, but actually it's like if the markets existed for the kind of stuff they're trying to produce, they would just do well. They would be fine. Like I could sell all of my product at the price that actually costs to produce. Okay, cool. I got a surplus this year. I can rent some more land. Like those things start to fall in place when the markets are there too. It's hard for me this is a really simple question, hard for me to type while I'm listening. Evan, has any research been done on media use of the term small farm or family farm? Not really that I know of. And that's kind of part of what led to my research. There's sort of this gap of like a really critical lens on this, though I'm sure there's something, but it's not like robust, but it's a good question. I'd like to look into it. I lost it here in the chat. Well, actually, maybe Chris, really quickly, someone asked, is grant funding impacted by this definition. You might know best, or Nathaniel might also know, but do they use
What definition?
like well, they put it at 827. So I think I was talking about the USDA right around that time. So I'm thinking like the USDA's definition is actually relevant. How relevant is that to your work or sort of, grant funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is relevant, and then I think a lot of these, I mean, I don't know, something like NRCS equips federal funding. They're trying to move towards being able to, for example, put like less than an acre of, for urban ag, for example, a lot of urban agricultural is less than an acre. So like if you can't enter your acreage in and you can't get funding for the projects and in transitions you're trying to do at your farm. And so I do think like it does matter for funding. And also I think, again, I think that there was a conversation in the chat about the block grant. I do think there's a lot of very fair critiques of the block grant, and it's not a perfect model. And I do think that it allows for a more contextually specific definition to be used for funding. I don't know how that would look at like a federal level with the USDA, and I don't often do, most of my work is at a state or a smaller level, so I can't speak to kind of some of these conversations that may or may not be happening at the federal level. But I think at a state level, I believe that, agencies and organizations are really trying to add within the confines of being a bureaucratic system, trying to add more context where it can be done.
We have 2 minutes, and maybe I could jump to Rachel real quick. You had said you do sort of feel that like acreage is kind of the most important part. So I'm going to bundle a couple of questions. One, Muriel asked, would it make any sense to define small as the ratio of farmers to acres? And I would sort of actually extend that a bit and say like farm owners to acres or farm workers to acres also. And if workers became worker owners, that's a different question. And then someone else in the chat also asked something about, is there a way to define smallness in terms of like your relationship to land? Like, can we actually go out and like identify like some measure or marker of like how close you are to the land? And that sounds like a lot of work. And it's probably why agencies like the USDA don't use those kinds of definitions. But that actually might be the most important way of thinking about it because it's so complex. But yeah, Rachel.
Well, I mean, with our last minute, I actually want to echo a point that you have made, Evan, in your paper, that small farms should be relational to other farms in the area. So what we're talking about right now is in the California context, right? So we're kind of talking about, maybe 4 to 20 acres being small and 40 to 350 being medium, but that might look very different in Brazil, like you had mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of quantifying the ratio, I had to think about that more. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it gets back a bit to this like hands in the soil, the family scale farm that Cass talking about, the relationship to land that Nathaniel's talking about. I don't know what that ratio would be, but I bet farmers would know better than anyone. But again, it looks so different whether you're talking about farm owners or farm workers. Well, it's so painful to cut this off, but we're at 9:15. And here comes Evan Wigg.
I just want to say this is such an amazing conversation, and I really hope this is just the beginning. As the organizer of the Small Farm Conference, I really do think this is such a juicy conversation and worthy of critique. When this event started, you have to put yourself in historical context. 1970s, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, for those of you who remember all the way back then, would go around the country telling farmers, his mantra over and over and over was, get big or get out. And so the response from that, all of the support for agribusiness, the support for farmers planting property line to property line, that was what this conference emerged in reaction to. Things have changed a lot since then, in the 40 years since then. And there's definitely opportunities for us to reevaluate what our terms are, what our meanings are. Sometimes it's, these words are shorthand for something much more complex. So I encourage you, if folks have any additional revisions for how we can define small farm in the way we talk about it here at the conference, Or hell, I'm not saying we're going to rename the conference, but we'd love to hear your feedback. So always get in touch. And I hope we continue this conversation. Big thanks to our 4 panelists today for joining us. And I imagine this conversation will carry on for the rest of the conference this week. And we hope to continue.
Thank you so much, Evan. Thanks to Kat for organizing. And I'm realizing I should have saved like 5 minutes for you to give some of us some of that context. That would have been great.
All good. I look forward to a future conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
All
Take
right,
care.
see
Hey,
ya.
thanks all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.